This is an updated version of the presentation that I gave at Wargame Developments Virtual Conference of Wargamers on the 8th of February 2025 on Matrix game simulation. In terms of what I'm going to cover, first of all I'm going to talk very briefly about what are conversational AIs, then talk about why it is we might want to simulate Matrix games, then talk very briefly about how the system works. Then for the original conference I gave some practical demonstrations. What I'll do here is I'll add in the show notes a link to the conversation transcript that we had with ChatGPT, and then finally summing up with what does it all mean. So in terms of how a conversational AI works, I did the obvious thing, which is ask ChatGPT how it works, and it told me it consists of a number of different elements. First of all, you've got the large language model element, which is that part which enables it to engage a very human-like conversation, giving a response to almost any question that you care to ask it. Secondly, it provides contextual understanding, and that's quite important in this particular experiment because we're going to provide it with information around the scenario and around a methodology, and we then expect everything it says to be driven by that particular context. Thirdly, it has elements of reasoning and decision making, and hopefully we'll see some of that in the sorts of responses that it creates whilst we're running the Matrix games. And then finally, it has access to external tools and capabilities. The most important one for this particular experiment is web search, which means you can actually access, as it says there, things like current events, so as to make sure that it feeds in real information into the scenario that it's playing through. So how do I actually sort of get to the point of doing this particular piece of work? I've been playing around with ChatGPT for a while, and I thought it'd be really good to actually have it running as a games master for Traveller, which is a sci-fi role-playing game I've been involved with for decades. However, what I discovered is whilst it actually is pretty good at being a GM, the thing it's really useless at is actually rolling dice and adding dice modifiers and then coming up with the results of those rolls. It just wasn't handling numbers very well. But as long as you kept it to the narrative side of being a GM, then it worked very nicely. So that got me thinking of, well, okay, rather than trying to use ChatGPT to run sort of very rigid war games, why don't I have a look at how we could use it to run a far freer design of war game, such as a Matrix game. So for those of you who aren't aware, a Matrix game is really just a structured discussion or a structured argument. So you have a games master or an umpire who runs the event. You then have a number of players. Each of those players typically represents a different country or a different faction. And then on each turn, they're presented, or at the beginning of the game, they're presented with a scenario. And then on each turn, each of the players says what it is that they want to take as their action for that turn, with a couple of arguments as to why the action should succeed. The other players can then come up with arguments as to why the action won't succeed. And then it's up to the umpire, by whatever method they choose, to decide whether or not the action has succeeded, and if so, what the effect is. When we think about sort of how we might want to use large language models within Matrix games, there's probably 4 different options of how we could go about it. The first one is we can just try and replace one of the human players with a bot. And that's already been done. There's a paper by my colleague Nick Riggs, and there's Griffin that's linked in there that shows an experiment where they did that. They didn't bother to tell the human players. All the human players thought it was a purely human game, but in the back, one of the players was talking to a bot and then feeding the information into the bot and getting the bot to give the actions and the moves that it wanted to do. The second approach is you could actually just replace the actual games master or the umpire with the bot and keep all the players as human. I'm sure somebody's done some work on that. I just haven't had the time to dig out the reference. The third option is that we actually replace everybody in the game with a bot, but each of those bots is quite independent. The advantage of this is it means that you can actually have sort of secret discussions, and you can make sure that one player definitely doesn't know what the other player might be doing. And again, there's a reference there at the bottom to a paper that was presented on Connections UK on some work that was done in that area. What I want to focus on here, though, is option 4, which is where we just have a single bot, a single instance of ChatGPT, and we effectively get that to play all the different roles, both all the players and the games master as well. And the principal reason for doing that is it's the simplest, and I can just set it up very quickly just by setting up a ChatGPT bot, and you're done. So as for why we might actually want to do this, in some ways it seems a very strange thing to do. Matrix games are very human games. It's all about human interaction, so people would tell you. But I think there's very good reasons why we might want to replace the human players, at least some of the time, with a bunch of bots. The first one is that it allows you to do massively more repetitions. So you can run the game, 10 times, 100 times, maybe even 1,000 times. And hopefully that means that you can see a wider variety of actions and a wider variety of outcomes from those games. Second, it means you can still play a Matrix game even if you haven't got enough humans around. And that might be due to reasons of time, cost, resource, or security. Quasi the hardest human to often get hold of is an umpire. And so being able to develop a good ChatGPT or LLM umpire for a Matrix game would be a very useful thing to be able to do. Thirdly, you can just explore ideas that might otherwise just be uneconomic to explore. It takes time, it takes money to actually set up a Matrix game, whereas actually here, we can set a game up and have it run probably inside of an hour. So maybe that lets us test out ideas and then come up with enough evidence to persuade somebody to actually fund this with human players. As I said, we can probably create a game and play it within an hour. So it means that you've got a very fast reaction. So the minute you hear a story, you could quickly put a game together, put it to ChatGPT and have it play it through a couple of times and begin to have a look at some of the responses and some of the possible outcomes of that scenario. As a sort of link to the idea about uneconomic, you can just use this to test ideas and to pre-test scenarios before human play. So if you're working on a Matrix game that's intended for human play, well, actually, why not sort of write it, give it to ChatGPT, get ChatGPT to play the game through, see if you feel it works, try out some different ideas, see whether or not you can sort of break it. So that hopefully that means that you've got a whole bunch of sort of virtual playtesting sorted out before the actual game goes anywhere near a human. And I should just point out, I'll be saying ChatGPT as sort of shorthand here for conversational AIs. There's no reason why you shouldn't use this approach on almost any of the large language models out there. And I've certainly used it quite successfully with Llama. The next item there, practicing writing Matrix games. To be quite honest, until I started this project, I'd never actually written a Matrix game. And this was actually a really good opportunity for me to understand how it is I would go about writing a Matrix game, to write one and actually see it played out in front of me by a bunch of bots or by a bot. And actually that's certainly improved my confidence for if I do want to write a Matrix game for human consumption, then I think I've now got a far better idea about what it is I'm trying to do. And also when you read through the transcript of one of these Matrix games, you'll see all sorts of ideas sparking out in terms of potential future scenarios, the generation of collateral that you might want to be used in other games. So this actual, the Matrix game played by ChatGPT could well have opportunities in terms of generating material for use elsewhere. In terms of other ideas as to why we might want to do it, the next one is about motivation to learn about the topic. Again, over the last 6 months or so, whilst I've been testing this system out, if I've seen something that's been interesting in the news, then I think, well, why not sit down and write a Matrix game scenario on that? And just the very act of writing that scenario means that you need to dig into the topic a bit more. You need to think about your views on the topic more. So actually, you're learning in a way that you wouldn't otherwise have learned about something. Another advantage, potentially, although I think there's a bit more evidence than research required in this area, is you would expect the games to be near repeatable. You're not going to get the same answer every time you play it, but at least the way in which the game is played is completely consistent. So that means you should be able to then go into the scenario, just tweak one or two variables, and then see how much that changes the impact on the outcome of the game. And linked to that, it actually also gives us a consistent framework that means that we can explore different issues over time. So potentially sort of evolving situation, in the South China Sea or in Eastern Europe. We've got that model that we're using, and all we're doing is each time we're just introducing a new scenario. And again, linked into that, it potentially gives us a consistent framework in which we can develop models of red, be that China or be that Russia, and see if we can make better and better models that reflect how we think that those countries might actually act within a variety of different scenarios. Move 37 is a reference to AlphaGo, and when sort of AlphaGo beat the world champion, the thing that it beat it on was this thing called Move 37, and it just came up with a move on the 37th turn which just nobody was expecting. No human player would ever have thought of that particular move. And so it may well be that by getting the Matrix games to be played by ChatGPT, that we suddenly see ideas coming out of there that nobody else would have ever thought of, and may actually have some sort of applicability in the real world. And then finally, and probably most simply, they act as a really good introduction to Matrix games. As I said, I've not had that much exposure to Matrix games. There's a real dearth of recordings out there of Matrix games being played for real. But this gives anybody the chance to actually see how a Matrix game works, basically sit on the sidelines whilst the bot plays out the game. So then when it comes to their chance to actually play in a human game, they've got a far better idea and far more confidence about how they're going to take part. So if we approach this from a slightly more sort of analytic point of view, if you talk to wargamers, particularly professional wargamers, one of the phrases they'll often come out with is that war games are simulation but with humans. And that if you take humans out of the war game, then you've no longer got a war game, what you've got is a computer simulation. And certainly, if you look at games with rigid adjudication, so that's sort of hex encounter type games, for want of a better term, then trying to create those as computer simulations is relatively trivial. And so we've got both these options. We can either play these games as war games with human players, or we can play them as computer simulations. And playing them as computer simulations gives a lot of the benefits that I've just described on the previous slides, in terms of repeatability, large numbers of repetitions, being able to change with single variables and so on. But obviously what you don't get is the human interaction and the human factors in playing the game. If we then look at games which have what we call free adjudication, which is where there aren't really many rules and it's far more about the humans interacting and the discussions and the arguments, then traditionally those have only ever been played by human players, and the Matrix game is an example of a free war game. So what it means is we've actually got what appears to be a missing quadrant here, where we have the ability to play free adjudication games such as Matrix games, which are very much sort of purely narrative in style, but we've actually got no human players involved in them whatsoever. And so, my contention here and in this presentation is that this idea of Matrix game simulation is a way of actually filling that missing quadrant and providing us a way, when we want to play free adjudication games such as Matrix games without any human players, to hopefully gain all of those benefits that I've just been through on the previous two slides. Of course, there is some problems in doing this. As with any game, garbage in, garbage out. If that scenario that you're feeding the system is badly framed, badly researched in the first place, then don't expect to learn much out of the way it's actually played by the system. There's definitely a question at the moment about whether or not the system actually works. I leave it to you to read the transcripts to decide how well you think it's currently working. But bear in mind, this is based on probably less than a year of having large language models that have the capability to run these sorts of games and play these sorts of games. So who knows what we'll be able to achieve in the next few years. Obviously, we've got no human insight from the games, we've got no human expertise, and it's certainly not a social experience. But if that's what we want, and if that's the focus, just great, just go and play a manual game and do it that way. Certainly, some of the research suggests that humans can be too trusting of computer outputs. So if you give ChatGPT a scenario, you get it to play 100 times, and then you go along to your boss with the outputs, and somebody comes along with a result from one human game, then it may well be those 100 computer printouts actually dominate over the single human game. So we need to be careful about what the level of trust we put in a computer output. And related to that, outputs can be seen as predictive. This is what we found in the Matrix game. This is what we think is going to happen. That's not how these games should be treated. They just give you one possible outcome for a particular scenario, but it's certainly not a prediction that is the outcome that's likely to happen. One of the things that I found, and you'll probably see it if you look at the linkage, the link to the transcript, is the system unfortunately generates text probably far faster than I can be bothered to read it. So fairly quickly you start asking the system to give you a summary of the turns rather than give you a blow-by-blow account of the turns. And so potentially you're losing a lot of nuances that may be there in the game. Potentially this might improve. We've already got the ability to sort of have the system read out as audio, sort of turn by turn, and you're soon going to be able to do that with video. So it may well be that actually you can just sit back and effectively almost watch a documentary play out in front of you as the computer plays through the Matrix game. And of course, you could always use AI analysis tools to actually look at the output and provide a summarization. But then you've got an AI analyzing and summarizing something that was created by AI. So us humans might as well go to the sofa, pop and have a cup of tea and leave the AIs to themselves. And the final point, slightly more seriously, is obviously all these large language models, because of the information they've been trained on from the web, do have a whole bunch of biases, and those biases are likely to be inherited within the Matrix game simulation, unless you make an effort to directly address them within the scenario. So in terms of how the system actually works, so we've got the large language engine. As I say, in this case, I'm using ChatGPT. I've used Llama, but you could use Gemini or any of the other ones which are out there. We're not doing anything to the engine. We're just using a straight off-the-shelf engine. We're not needed to retrain that engine or anything else like that. We're just signing up, creating an account on ChatGPT and using the engine that's there. The reason why I've been using ChatGPT is it has these things called custom ChatGPTs, which is where you provide a pre-prompt so that whenever anybody interacts with that particular custom ChatGPT, all the interaction will be interpreted in terms of that pre-prompt. Which allows you to create effectively bots with different personalities or different roles. So what I've done in this case is I've created a pre-prompt, which is just a simple text file of instructions, and that explains to ChatGPT how I want the Matrix game run. I should point out that I don't actually need to do that. If you just ask any ChatGPT what a Matrix game is and how to run it, it will describe exactly how a game is run, and will go on and run the game for you. But this way I've got some control over the way in which the game is run, and you could obviously change that to change the sort of the flavour of Matrix game if you want. Just to add a bit more information and a bit more context, I also provided with a number of articles on running Matrix games, so there may be information in there that it can draw on. One of the problems with LLMs is you're never quite sure what information it's using at any given time, and there's possibly some interesting unit tests to be done to see whether or not it's actually using some of that information that I'm providing it with. And then the final element is the actual Matrix game scenario, and that is simply a PDF document written in a very human style. And in fact, I've been able to take Matrix games which were designed for human players and just load them straight into ChatGPT without any changes, and they work quite happily. One thing, or a couple of things to note, is ChatGPT doesn't tend to understand maps at the moment, so there's no point having maps in those scenarios, and it doesn't tend to understand tables. So again, sort of tables of military strengths or orbats, there's probably not a lot of point putting those in either. So with both of those, you just want to try and describe them as text, and that's what the system will work with. So that's the system, and once you set up that pre-prompt, then it really is just a question of writing a scenario, saving it as PDF, uploading it to ChatGPT, and telling it to play the game. So, as I say, what I've done in the notes at the bottom of the video is I've put in a link to the chat script, to the chat transcript that we had with ChatGPT during the conference. And what you'll see there is, first of all, I load it up with a scenario for a Matrix game based on the potential US actions around Greenland. And you can see there sort of who the players are. And each of the players has been given some aims for the game. They've been told what resources they've got available to them. And then the system then actually just plays through the game over the course of a 6-month period. And I've told ChatGPT in this case to treat each turn as being about, I think, a month in terms of elapsed time. At the first couple of turns, I play them sort of explicitly, so I get ChatGPT to give me all of the arguments from all sides and all the counter arguments. Somebody pointed out after about the first or second turn that we didn't have China in the list of players, so I just told ChatGPT to add China in as a player, and it was quite happy to do that and then carry on the game. As I said earlier on, actually reading all the transcripts tends to get a bit boring. So what we then started to do was just tell it for each turn, just to give us the summary at the end of what the state of the game is. But you could actually then go back and say, well, okay, can you explain in more detail, what happened, if say in the USA turn during that particular turn. And so we ran that through to conclusion. At the end of the game, we get a summary of the whole game. And within my description of a Matrix game, I've asked it to actually score each player on a -5 to +5 in terms of how well they achieved their objectives. And so ChatGPT gives me that summary. And then one of the people who was watching the session said they actually had a Matrix game which they'd been used with human players, but they were interested to see whether or not ChatGPT could handle it. So he emailed me that across during the session. I just loaded it straight up to ChatGPT and told ChatGPT to start playing the game. And that's a scenario based around the Spanish Civil War. And we followed that through. And again, it appears to give a perfectly decent play. And he said, it's probably just as good as some of the human players he had playing the game for real. So say if you follow the link down in the notes for the video, you'll be able to have a look at that transcript. So what are some of the lessons from the work that I've been doing so far? First of all, ChatGPT knows a lot already. As I say, it knows how to play Matrix games. It knows all about the USA. It knows all about China. It knows all about Russia. It knows all about Greenland. So you really don't need to be too explicit in the instructions you give it, because it's got the gift of the gab. And if there's one power of these large language models, that's it, is they can just talk about anything. You obviously just need to be wary that some of what they say may be complete rubbish. A counter, though, to that, in terms of knowing a lot, is it actually appears to quickly forget things. So you'll put something in your instructions either for the scenario or even for how to run the Matrix game, and it will remember those instructions, first, second time round. But by the third time round, it begins to forget some of them. Just as an instance, I did a scenario back in September before the US elections based on the future of the Russia-Ukraine war. And within the scenario, I said that come November, you've got to make a decision as to who's won the US presidential election, and then play out the rest of the game on that basis. First couple of games, it did it quite happily. Third and fourth game, it just totally forgot the instruction to hold a US election. And again, we need to do some unit testing so as to understand why it is that we see that sort of forgetting of information. There's also a danger, I think, you get seduced into writing very human instructions, and it's not really clear which of those instructions it's understanding and which it isn't. So again, that's something else that I'm keen to do some unit testing on in the near future. Some of you may be familiar with the term Chekhov's gun, and that comes from one of Chekhov's plays. It starts off with a revolver on the table in Act 1, Scene 1. And there is sort of an assumption on the part of the audience that gun is going to get used on somebody by the end of the play. And I think we have a very similar thing happening sometimes with ChatGPT, which is you might just mention something almost in passing in the scenario description, but ChatGPT then sort of latches onto that, and it suddenly becomes sort of unduly important in the scenario. Again, we want to do some unit testing to understand what causes some of that to work. But in other instances, it just never spots things at all. So in this Greenland scenario, I've put a whole bunch of information in there about the Sirius Patrol, which is the Danish patrol, a bit like the sort of SAS, the SBS, that patrols the Arctic wastes at the top end of Greenland, and it's never used it in any of the Matrix game simulations it's run yet. Within my way of defining how a Matrix game works, I asked ChatGPT to generate a personality for each of the players. These aren't the actors, the state actors, but each of the supposed players playing the game, and use that to sort of inform the way they then played their roles. I'm not sure if that works. I'm also not sure to what extent, when we tell ChatGPT in a scenario to say, play Trump or play Putin, we're actually seeing necessarily the personality of those people coming through. I think so. We're certainly seeing the style of approach of the state actor, and so I think there's a bit more work possibly to be done around looking at how you create personalities. And within the session itself, we had a good discussion around the use of biographies and whether or not we could start to feed those in as part of the contextual information. Something that's been pointed out by other people is that ChatGPT always appears to want to please. So it always sort of likes to bring things to a nice conclusion. It likes to answer questions in the affirmative. And so in wargaming terms, it really suffers from what we call last turn itis. What that means is the game still always comes to a conclusion. People often go mad on the last turn of a game. And so most of the games I've played so far with ChatGPT, if there is the option by the end of the game, say to arrive at some sort of peace agreement, then at the end of the game on the last turn it will arrive at a peace agreement. It never tends to leave things hanging. The traditional way of dealing with this within a manual war game is you tell the players that the game is going to last for 8 turns, but you finish it on turn 6. And I think potentially you need to be doing the same thing with ChatGPT. ChatGPT seems to be very safe in the choices. So, given the capabilities it's got at its disposal through the various state actors, it does tend to play fairly safe, it strikes me. And also when it comes to looking at the outcomes of the various actions, it tends to choose sort of just failed or just succeeded rather than failed massively or massively succeeded. So again, there may well be something to do to improve that. Originally, I had the GM rolling a set of dice or set of virtual dice and then using that to drive the answer or the outcome. But as I said earlier on, I found that was quite inconsistent with the way that ChatGPT was handling dice throwing at least 6 or 9 months ago. But if that can be made to work, then that's definitely a way to solve it. As I say there at the end, yeah, that sort of hard dice modifier type adjudication just seems to be a little bit beyond ChatGPT, certainly as it was a few months ago. So sort of just to bring this to a conclusion, you may well be familiar with this term FICINT, so fictional intelligence. And it's spurred on by people like Singer and Cole. People are writing fictional accounts of what the future might be like. But actually by reading those accounts, by letting their sort of fiction authors' brains explore ideas, they might come up with all sorts of things that those people doing more traditional analysis just don't turn up. So the question, or the proposition here is that maybe we've got a similar thing with the use of large language models, and more broadly this class of things called generational adversarial networks. Which is, and we can apply that to text or to images or to video. But basically we can get the idea, we can get the computer to think things up. And then we can look at what they've thought up and then try and decide whether or not there's any sense in that. And years ago, there was a story in Omni magazine, which really caught my attention at the time. And I think subsequently doing some research, I think it was actually based on a book by Jean-Louis Bourget, and this idea of the Library of Babel. And there is actually a website now called librarybabel.info. And the proposition there is basically if you just randomly generate every combination of letters and turn that into pages of a book, you will have every piece of text that has ever been written. In the science fiction story, I think it was something like the designs for a time machine. But it could be every single secret cable, the secret Russian war plans, just absolutely any piece of information is going to be in there. But of course, so would all the false versions and the broken versions and the totally made up versions. But it does strike me that effectively through getting the ChatGPT type systems to play these matrix games, all of a sudden it lets us generate a whole variety of these different possible futures. Which we as humans can then sort of sit down and look at with a slightly cooler head and see what lessons we can learn from that sort of GAN generated intelligence and then hopefully use that to make better decisions for the future. So that's the end of the presentation. Again, I've put a link in the video description to my Substack, which is where I've got a 3-part article where I introduce the idea of matrix game simulation, and where I'll also link into things like the transcript and then subsequent scenarios I've run since then. And finally, if anybody wants to have a conversation with me about anything that's raised here or wants to see the system in action, then these are my contact details, and look forward to speaking to you. Thank you very much.